Hello, everyone. I hope everyone had a great weekend and is doing well. My name is Ramsha Siddiqa, and I'm currently working as a communications and advocacy lead at Better, Challenging Taboos. As we all know, that two global events, ICFP 2025 and COP30, are around the corner, and the conversations will be around SRHR, GBV, and moreover, these platforms are where we discuss and advocate for gender responsive climate action. Hence, today's topic of discussion is integrating SRHR and GBV into climate justice, feminist pathways for a stronger gender action plan. Uh, Before we dive into the discussion, I want to welcome all the participants who have joined us for this session. After this session, we will direct your questions to the speaker uh, who you have questions for. So if you have any question during the discussion, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box. Um, Now I'd like to introduce the three incredible speakers on the panel who are a part of today's important discussion. I will I will begin by introducing Menka Gounden. Menka is a feminist leader, influencer, researcher, manager, and human rights activist from Fiji. She is currently a program director at the Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, also known as ARROW. She has worked at the Pacific Center for Peace Building, uh, the Women's Rights Movement, and the Women's Fund Fiji, supporting women's access to justice, peace, and human security, intergenerational leadership, and human rights research, training, and advocacy. Also served as secretary to Fiji NGO Coalition on Human Rights. So, welcome, Menka. Now I'd like to introduce Claudia Rubio Giraldo. Claudia is a Dominican Colombian feminist lawyer and activist at Women's Environment and Development Organization, also known as WeDo. She serves as co-convener of the Gender and Environment Data Alliance and supports the collection, analysis, and use of data in the Gender Climate Tracker. She's also coordinator at the Gender Working Group of the Women and Gender Constituency at the UNFCCC. And welcome, Claudia. And now I'd like to introduce Semyon Hilary Lenantoi. Uh, Semyon is the executive director of the Inclusive Culture Action Network, also known as ICANN, a youth and women-led organization advancing gender equality, indigenous rights, and climate justice across northern Kenya. She's a climate and peace ambassador and Miss Climate Kenya 2025, uh, and serves on the Kenya Youth Advisory Group with the MasterCard Foundation in partnership with IREX. Uh, she brings over 7 years of frontline and leadership experience in advancing GBV prevention, SRHR, youth empowerment, and climate resilience. Her work champions feminist, community driven approaches that center Indigenous women and youth in advancing social and environmental justice. So, welcome, Simeon. Um, Now, the objective of the discussion is to understand the intersections between SRHR, GBV, and climate justice, and to also explore and advocate for the integration of SRHR, GBV into climate justice and gender action plans. By highlighting how climate crises exacerbate gendered vulnerabilities, Moreover, in ensuring climate action centers the rights and lived experiences of women, girls, and the marginalized communities. I will begin. And so my first question is to Menka. Given Arrow's emphasis on how climate-induced disasters in the Asia Pacific region impacts women's reproductive health and justice, how do you define the intersection between SRHR, GBV, and climate justice in your context?
Thank you, Ramsha, for that question, and thanks for having me today. So I think for us, and we've been working on this particular intersection for a couple of years now at Arrow, more than a decade. And, one of the things that we have understood, and there's a lot of literature out there that also understands this, is that the impact of climate change is not gender neutral. And though it affects everyone. And so at the crux of it is for us to understand on how women and girls in all their diversities, including, intersections like Indigenous women, women and girls with disabilities, individuals with limited financial resources, inadequate education, restricted access to technology, those residing in hazard-prone areas, like in northern Pakistan, are disproportionately vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. And so these disproportionate impacts are a manifestation of gender inequality. And this underscores climate solutions that are designed with poor gender lens. And so the impacts sometimes have irreversible consequences on health systems, including on the sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls, and on socioeconomic factors. Now, this pre-existing inequality is rooted in a complex interplay of social, cultural, legislative and institutional factors that create barriers for building climate resilient societies with women in all their diversities, working as equal partners. And so when these inequalities are exacerbated during climate change and other disasters, women and girls are even more vulnerable to sexual and gender-based violence. Some of our studies, and Arrow has been conducting studies in a few countries across Asia and Pacific, and our studies in countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, Philippines show that climate change is a driver for community to resort to early child and forced marriages. In Nepal, when climate extreme events happen, oftentimes young girls are among the first to be affected to the extent they're forced to drop out of school. And the increasing workload in the household and economic hardships that the family experiences would cause parents to withdraw their daughters from school so that they could either help out in the home or on the farm or to find a job to supplement the household's income. Now, this is just one particular example on how harmful practices are exacerbated on the onset of disaster, whether it be a long-term onset or a short-term onset of disaster. And so, in answering your question, the definition can be, there's no set defined way to say, this is what climate change, GBV and SRHR intersections look like, because they look different in different contexts. So I just gave you an example about Nepal, which for them and for that particular community, it may look like girls dropping out of school. Or in certain communities, and we have also conducted a study with a partner in Pakistan, it also looks like child early forced marriage. Or in Bangladesh, in the study, it looked like internal migration, or it looks like the inability to access fresh water, which leads to other health consequences for women, including things like genital infections, etc. So, which in turn leads to a long-term prevalence of gender-based violence. So, whilst we can in all our glory as people who work in this field use polished and fancy words to describe it, but in the community level, these are examples of what this intersection actually looks like. Yeah, and I think that's the best I can do in this couple of minutes to explain that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Venka. I think what you spoke about is very important to highlight, and those were some really important points. And even like if I share from the Pakistan perspective, after the 2022 floods and after the 2025 floods, even when Betak went for like on their drives, we learned that these issues that existed after the 2022 floods still exist. And in fact, these issues are just, like increasing. And so it's very important to include these realities into gender action plans. So thank you for sharing that. I will direct my next question to Simeon. Uh, Working with indigenous and climate affected communities in northern Kenya, what are the impacts of climate induced disasters on SRHR services or increased GBV risk in your context?
So thank you so much, Ramsha, and warm greetings to everyone today. So for me, this conversation is personally deep for me. It resonates personally with me because I come from Samburu County, where our communities face extreme climate shocks. That includes drought, just like how Menka said, flash droughts, and unpredictable rainfalls, and they all have repercussions on the effect. So this environmental change is not just ecological challenges, they intensify and they cause inequality, especially for the girls, women, and the youth. So for me, I can basically say I'm honored to be on this platform, and thank you so much for this. So back to the question, I can say from the northern Kenya, the climate-induced disasters create cascade effects on social and reproductive health outcomes. For example, during the drought in 2019 to 2020, the drought in Samburu, livestock death left families with limited food and income. Many families had to relocate, just like how Menka said. They relocate to distant towns, creating unsafe migration patterns for girls. And in this context, girls face a lot of risk of sexual reproductive health and early marriages. And also we have the water scarcity, whereby this leads to women and girls traveling for long distance from 5 to 10 kilometers daily for water. Of course, they face a lot of challenges from exposure to harm and harassment and violence. And then we also have the health facilities. These health facilities are often under-resourced. For example, in my county, they are too far for communities to access. So among the TSOs in our communities that operate to help the community, there's a field survey we did, and we showed that during drought periods, there is a drop of visiting to the clinics by 40%. And then there's high spike of pregnancies and GBV cases. So to the question whereby you asked the responses, I can say that the responses is community grounded and multifaceted. So for the mobile reproductive health units, whereby they deliver contraceptives, parental care, and also counseling directly to the villages affected. We also have the safe space for women and girls, whereby they allow survivors of GBV to access counseling and legal support and peer support. We also have, for the community grounded, we can say that we train community champions, both men and women, to mediate conflicts over water and pasture. This will reduce the risk of violence linked to resource scarcity. So what we see on the ground is that climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's a social norm, economic pressure, and it's geared by power and imbalance. It gears imbalance and power. So this is why solutions must integrate all: sexual productive health, GBV, prevention, and climate resilience. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emian, for sharing that. I think it like you highlighted the unique challenges of Kenya, and those are very important to highlight. And absolutely what you said, that it's very important to work on gendered solutions. So thank you for sharing that. My next question is to Claudia. With WeDo's leadership as part of the coordination of the Women in Gender Constituencies Gender Working Group and the work following the gender negotiations, why is it important that climate justice processes like GAP, which is Gender Action Plan, include SRHR and GBV frameworks, and what are the key entry points?
Thank you so much. And I think like really echoing what my fellow panelists have said. Um, so I think like it's evident that there's like this connection, like there's connection between climate change and that this is like a health crisis with gender dimensions. So what we're talking about now is like how to take that into like the multilateral space. So like the multilateral space, by that I mean like the global advocacy space. So how do we actually make like what's happening on the ground be connected to what's happening like in these like overarching massive conversations that are happening at the COPs, that are happening in the climate negotiations. And that is like the job that we're doing within the woman and gender constituency. So I think the first recognition is that the global advocacy space, these like climate negotiations are so broad and they're so massive and they're so affected by the same systems that are damaging our systems from the core. So like patriarchy is present in these negotiations, capitalism, imperialism are all present in these negotiations. But we choose to engage with this multilateral space because this is the space that sets the norms and the standards that also allows the ways to shape finance, to shape policy flows. So we need to be there to influence, to advocate, and to shape it. So following on what Menka and what Samaya were saying, um, we need to recognize that this is happening on the ground and then say, okay, how do we translate this into this space? And that means basically highlighting like connecting it to the real issue. So for example, now in the gender action plan, the gender action plan basically seeks to advance gender equality within the COP space or within the UNFCCC, which is the big convention, the biggest climate change convention in the world. So it seeks to advance gender responsive climate action by connecting it to national level action. So what it does is that it has like an implementable framework of like let's say 30 activities, and those 30 activities should lead to a more national level action on the ground. So at this COP, at COP 30, there's going to be the negotiation of the gender action plan. This gender action plan has already existed for several years, but this is the first time that we see the possibility of integrating SRHR, GBV, care work. Like these words are already in the language of the current gender action plan. And that is important because it is the first mentions that we're seeing on this within this climate change multilateral space. And if we see it in this broader climate change multilateral space, then it is more possible for that to be translated into national level context. If there is a mandate in this like global advocacy space, then that can be translated into the different levels where it's going to be even more useful. So that is why it is important that these frameworks are integrated into the SRHR, the GBV, the care work are integrated into frameworks such as the GAP or such as these other policy. But that said, like these policies are also very limited. They're not like the end all be all, the most important thing. Like the most important thing is localized action. But the hope is that advocacy at this global arena will really help have more effective action and have more finance and have more access so that those the organizations, the communities that are doing that like that ground level work really have more opportunities to do that work more effectively. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for sharing that. And it's good to know that these conversations will be a part of COP30, and we are getting more closer to integrating SRHR, GBV, and care into gender action plans. And so my next question will be for Menka. In your work, emphasizing the SRHR climate nexus in the Asia Pacific and aeroscoping studies, when developing or updating a gender action plan, which specific sections or entry points do you see as the most promising for embedding SRHR and GBV dimensions?
Thank you, Ramsha. I can see some of those who are participants here in this panel have gone through Arrow's gender and climate, the different not the webinars, the different capacity strengthening we have based on Arrow's Gender and Climate Manual, or the Gender Champions Academy flagship program that we have. And for those who have gone through that, they would have already heard that, we talk about gender mainstreaming approaches and we talk about human rights-based approaches in that as two particular schools of thought on how we should be taking a lensing into doing gender action plans. And both these approaches places importance in terms of intersectional issues. And I don't think that, and I personally feel that there is not one area or one entry point into putting, or if you want to, integrate SRHR or GBV or any other intersectional issue pertaining to the needs, based on any gender needs assessment that you would have done for any action plan, I think it's something that needs to be reflected throughout to guide and to nuance the way we work. I mean, we do have increasing recognition of gender-responsive climate action, but we do know that only limited attention has been paid to the linkage between climate change and SRHR or climate change and GBV, or even the one that's, we can see up and coming is also climate change and tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And the barriers to the realization of SRHR will definitely inhibit progress towards gender equality and may also impede climate action in turn. And so reflecting this, like I said, throughout, because I don't think we are at a point where, there's one certain entry point to this issue, a more a concerted, but also a all-encompassing approach is what is needed. And definitely this is something that we all have been also doing throughout the, the process of the revitalization of the gender action plan that has been happening. So I wouldn't leave it to, okay, this is the particular section that, it should reflect XYZ, or this is the particular entry point. But like I said, a more contextualized approach to it, a more, something that really bombards, for lack of a better word, but the bombards that the issue at the root cause of it, and we're not at that point. We are saying that yes, there's gender responsive climate action, but to really, this is the tip of the iceberg. We haven't really examined what what lies under the water, and how that does affect women, girls in all their diversities across the world. So yeah, I wouldn't say, but I would say to take an approach on a human rights-based approach. More look at tools around gender mainstreaming. There are different tools that are available out there, and I know that all of us, Aero, BETAC, we all have different tools that are available on our different websites to look at on how this intersectional lensing can be done. So yeah, I think that's a good starting point to also equip ourselves with that type of tools and lensing, so that when we are doing action plans, be it for a small project in a community or be it something as large as UNFCCC's GAP, we are able to have that sort of nuance and language into inputting into that discourse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Menga. And I think, like you mentioned, it's very important to look at it from a broader perspective and also, but contextualized every uh, aspect of the gender action plan and like look at it from a nuanced approach. So thank you for sharing that. And and I think advocating for integration of SRHR and GBV and care into gender action plans has not been easy. So my next question is to Claudia. Given your work with the Gender and Environment Data Alliance and the Gender Working Group of the Women and Gender constituency, what are the principal barriers you have observed when trying to include SRHR and GBV explicitly in a women and gender responsive plan, gender action plan? For example, lack of sex, gender, disaggregated data, limited dedicated funding, or social norms?
Thank you so much. That's a great question. And I think the barriers are like multiple as we see with anything relevant to this type of work. I think in the negotiations there's a lot of the conversations that we're having in different arenas of our work are not happening still within the UNFCCC. Like within the UNFCCC, we still have conversations around, what does in like for example, there's language that like goes beyond the gender as a binary, and there's a lot of conversations around what does the binary mean, what does gender mean, should we have the word gender. So there's a lot of conversations that have been kind of stumbling the process or delaying the process that don't really allow us to have like these deeper conversations that need to happen, for example, around SRHR. So I think first all countries come to this process with different opinions, with different national legislations, with different like kind of national context. So that means that they bring that forward to the table, to the negotiating table. And some countries don't recognize the same rights that other countries do. And I'm not gonna name specific countries here, but I think like we all know which countries, or we can imagine which countries have like more frameworks that recognize more rights and that recognize SRHR in its fullness, and other countries that do not recognize that. So that those same conflicts come forward in the climate negotiations. You have countries that say we're not going to have any language on SRHR, and other countries that say that's the type of language that we precisely want. So I think at first the biggest conflict is regarding those national circumstances. Then of course there's the lack of data also makes it that much more difficult, because if there's no data, then countries don't recognize why the climate crisis is also a health crisis with gender dimensions. If there was data that was like gender disaggregated, that was detailed, and I think a lot of that work is happening with community-based organizations that are gathering that data and are collecting that data, but then that data has to be taken to the global advocacy space. And that is the work, for example, that organizations that are part of the women and gender constituency are doing, where they're really trying to make sure that both areas are connected, like the national, the local with the global. So I think there's multiple barriers, and I think all of the ones that you mentioned are like finance is limited, data is limited, political will is limited, and the conversations still are like so stuck in some like topics of the past that like it just doesn't allow for that progress to be necessary. But there has been like decades and decades of feminist organizations fighting for the integration of language within this space, and even the mention of the word gender within the UNFCCC is thanks to like civil society and feminist organizations being there, really advocating for this language. So the hope is that that continuous strong advocacy that all of our organizations are doing here will eventually translate to having that language in an instrument such as the GAP. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for sharing that. And so my next question is for Simeon. Reflecting on your leadership and your work spanning GBV prevention, SRHR, and climate adaptation, how can donors, national policymakers, civil societies collaborate to ensure SRHR and GBV are not just referenced, but meaningfully resourced and implemented in climate-related funding, programs, and gender action plans?
Oh, thank you so much for that important question. So what I can say is to ensure meaningful integration of SRHR and GBV in climate action, we must move beyond simply mentioning these issues in framework and start resourcing them into the core pillars of resilience. How do we do that? So at the policy level, national climate action plans and the gender action plan should include specific measurable indicators for SRHR and also GBV. This means that we can evaluate climate projects. How? We should not only ask how many trees we've planted or how many households have received water, but like how our partner has said here, that numbers and data, we should how we can do it is we can ask questions like, did women and adolescents girls gain safer access for reproductive health? Like the real questions that really matter. And also, did GBV risk reduce affected communities? So, for example, at the policy level, we can say that during the last drought in Kenya, the last drought cycle, we can say that many health posts in Samburu and Marsabit were closed due to migration and resources. It increased because women had to work for hours, like I said, and the areas were unsafe, and also to reach for the health facilities. So without integrated planning and climate adaptation project, we may unintentionally increase GBV risk and our maternal vulnerability. This is why it's crucial for the sexual productive health rights and also GBV become part of resilient matrix, not just an afterthought. And how we can also do that is there's nothing we can do without money, right? So at the budget level, donors and government should allocate earmarked funding for integrated social productive health right and GBV interventions within climate programs. So we've seen many well-written policies that acknowledge women's vulnerability, but they fail to implement because there's no budget line for things like mobile clinics, menstrual health kits, social cycle support, or GBV safe spaces during climate emergencies. So climate finance must intentionally include gender and health components. So communities don't have to choose between food and dignity. Another one at the community level is civil societies, CSOs like ICANN, are key connectors. In the northern Kenya, we work with indigenous pastoralists and women and youth who are often the first to experience the impact of drought or floods. So, for example, in the 2022, we partnered with local clinics and youth groups to set up telemedicine reproductive health consultation when roads were cut off and they could not access facilities. And also, we were able to train youth for peace champions to map safe pathways for girls traveling from schools and health centers. So a small and critical intervention that reduced GBV risk while ensuring that continued access to essential services. So bottom line is collaboration between policies, donors, and grassroots actors ensure that integration is not just theoretical, but it has physical outcomes and transformative. So it's about putting climate justice into practical by resourcing the safety, dignity, and health of those most affected. And by that, we need data and to help women, girls, and the indigenous youth. So yes.
Thank you so much, Simeon, for sharing that. Like you mentioned, it's very important to include everyone in all their diversities. And like you also expressed, and like Claudia also expressed, that we need to have more evidence-based studies where we collect data to support our advocacy. And And so thank you for sharing that. So my next question would be, we have discussed how important it is to integrate SRHR, GBV care into gender action plans. But Menga, my question to you is, how can integrating SRHR or addressing GBV within climate response make a difference?
Um, so I think, and we would have heard it before, that the integration of SRHR and GBV are definitely important to broader health outcomes and broader development outcomes. The integration of SRHR is actually a cornerstone of women and girls empowerment and human rights, and we've also seen this being recognized by the likes of, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and others, as a pathway to climate resilience development and as an important multi-sectoral approach when it comes to climate adaptation and resilience building. We need to note, especially in this current climate where we've seen recent aid cuts, that will have grave health consequences for women and girls. We see that when we don't invest in SRHR, or if we don't invest in curtailing gender-based violence, we will eventually see health outcomes and the progresses that we've made towards health outcomes eroding. SRHR is just not limited to contraceptives or family planning services, etc. It also is important for critical services during pregnancy, childbirth, postnatal care, and in the prevention and the care given during these times also affect underlying health conditions for women and girls, like anemia, like malaria, like non-communicable diseases, and if we don't include SRHR or GBV outcomes in this, in also climate action, the vulnerability for these health issues, but not only health issues, development issues, example, socioeconomical issues, as I had mentioned earlier, in the first question, with girls dropping out of school, etc., these will definitely increase. Thank you.
Thank you, Menka, for answering that question. My next question would be to Semir. So how do youth-led organizations or indigenous communities participate in this intersectional work? Because we have mentioned how it's very important to uh, to ensure that these actions are inclusive.
So thank you for that question. And so when we talk about integrating social productive health and GBV into climate justice, we must remember that real change doesn't just start in policy rooms. It starts with the grassroots. And that's where the realities of climate change, gender equality, and social inclusion intersect most powerfully. So in the northern Kenya, where I come from, pastoralists and indigenous communities live in the front line of climate change, like how I just answered the first question with the challenges that they face. So we have the movement whereby girls have to go fetch water in long distances and many others. So they lose access to basic health because of this repercussion and health. They lack access to basic health and also reproductive services. So when we speak of climate adaptation, we cannot separate it from sexual reproductive health and GBV prevention. So for instance, during the prolonged drought of 2022 to 2023, many women in Samburu, my county, and the Marsabit missed checkups for their health facilities because they were too far, like I said earlier. And at the same time, girls drop out of schools, being married off at an early age as a coping mechanism for families to get access to other dowry payment in terms of cow. So these realities, this is a real intersection where environment stress meets social vulnerability. So for ICANN, I can say that we've tried to respond by putting communities at the center of the solution. That is the only way we can say. For example, we as ICANN, we did the youth and women leadership, whereby we champion the women and the youth to become first responders of their community, not just for climate issues, but also for GBV and sexual reproductive health awareness. During the drought, for example, the youth volunteer, the ones that use motorbikes to distribute dignity kits and contraceptives to remote settlements, ensuring that women and adolescents, girls maintain boldly during this crisis. And we've also integrated indigenous knowledge and rights, whereby many indigenous communities have already have a strong ecological knowledge that they need to understand things like water cycle, grazing patterns, natural regeneration, whereby their voices are often excluded from decision-making spaces. So at ICANN, we try to do the storytelling and participatory mapping to ensure the indigenous women experience informed adaptation plans of knowledge. So we also had the linking local action to global agendas, whereby grassroots action should not end in the village, whereby we deliberately connect these stories and data to national and international platforms. And by documenting their lived experiences, translating into the evidence policies whereby they cannot be ignored, just trying to make change. So what I'm saying is that grassroots integration means moving from viewing communities as beneficiaries to recognizing them as co-creators of climate resilience, okay? So it means ensuring indigenous women and youth and marginalized voices are not just heard, but learned and heeded. So their local innovations and traditional knowledge become the backbone of national global climate strategies. So because ultimately, climate justice is about people, their dignity, their safety, and their right to thrive, not just the right to survive. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Semian, for that. I think what you said in the beginning, that policies are not made in the rooms, but at the grassroots level, I think that was very powerful. And at Betek also, whenever we try to, intervene in the grassroots community, we always go with an approach to co-create solutions with them, and also to ask what are their needs and what are their challenges. So even for the relief drive that we did after 2025 floods, we asked the community what did they want and what relief looked like for them. So it's very important to, like include grassroots voices and co-create solutions with them. So thank you for sharing that. So my next question would be to Claudia. How can we ensure community voices are included in design, implementation, and accountability of gender just climate action?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that's another great question. And I think um, yeah, like as my fellow panelists were saying, like it doesn't really make sense to have any type of climate justice if this isn't considered as well. So that's why the woman and gender constituency came to be. And I think in response to this question, I want to explain a little bit more about what the woman and gender constituency is. So the woman and gender constituency is one of the 9 formal constituencies of the UNFCCC. What does that actually mean? It means like this is one of the formal spaces to engage with this like massive convention. So the WEC gets key information, key updates. Many of the organizations here are part of the WEC already. And basically are the way to engage as civil society with the UNFCCC space. Within the woman and gender constituency, we work to coordinate the views of women's rights, feminist, and gender equality focused civil society organizations in the UNFCCC process. And everything that happens there is through collective advocacy. That collective advocacy is exactly what hopes to bring all of the voices from all of the organizations across the world that are working with women's rights, with SRHR, with GBV, on the topic of climate change, and bring them together to have a more collective voice. So the whole idea behind the woman and gender constituency is that a collective voice is stronger. if we speak together as civil society, then we can actually influence the negotiations. We can change the negotiations. We can like really say that there's a voice out there speaking. And it's just not parties talking to each other without any objective, but the civil society is watching, is influencing, is shaping, is aware, and is bringing the voices of those who cannot be there towards this space. So the Women and Gender constituency also has the role, has the privilege, has the duty of making sure that those voices are integrated. And I think my encouragement today to all of you also is to be, if you want to wish to be part of this work, to join the Women and Gender constituency. This is an open listserv, so you can just sign up to the advocacy listserv. When you sign up to the advocacy listserv, you get updates of what's happening. You can join different working groups. There's different working groups on gender, just transition, agriculture, technology, adaptation. You can join all of these working groups and really get into the nitty gritty of what's happening in this global advocacy space. So this is a space that is meant to be for everyone. And so if you wish to become involved in any way, shape, or form, please let me know. I'll like leave my email in the chat, and I'm sure Ramsha will share as well. And yeah, you can like join and be part of this like collective effort, because the most important thing is that all of the voices here are part of these conversations and contribute to that design, to that implementation, to that shaping of what the gender action plan is. And to give an example of this, the only reason that today there is SRHR, that there's GBV within the current draft of the gender action plan, is because civil society has been there. And other community has been represented there through the Women and Gender constituency and through other constituencies. So there's a lot of work that has gone behind this current draft of the gender action plan. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. And like you mentioned, the whole point and purpose is to also share solidarity and collectively advocate. And so last few questions, and I just want to touch over, like I want to discuss how a future vision, how do we envision future, and few call to actions. So my question would be to Menka, looking ahead to 2-3 years, what would success look like for integrated SRHR, GBV, and climate outcomes? And what is Arrow doing to move toward the vision?
Yeah, thank you, Ramsha. So I think for someone like me, it would definitely look like SRHR and GBV, especially SRHR, not be a contested language in in official documents, and that we're able to freely talk about the long-term outcomes of integrating SRHR, etc., in the way that we want to talk about it as people who are working in this field. Many times and this has been a reoccurrence for us, a lot of us, is that we see SRHR in draft language, etc., but by the time we get to a finalized language, we don't usually get that. So the ability to see that, and government and policymakers in the next couple of years are able to recognize that and the importance of that, not only from a population development lens, but from a all-encompassing development sort of lens, that would be great. Now, how are we doing that? Or at least for Aero in the Asia Pacific region and in the global south as well, we have been organizing and we have been able to be connectors through multi-stakeholder dialoguing processes, be it on CSE, be it on gender responsive climate action, be it on the Summit for the Future process, or be it for different intergovernmental processes around human rights, etc. In the last 24 months at least, we have organized a myriad of multi-stakeholder dialogues to be able to bring civil society actors, government actors, policymakers, intergovernmental organizations and agencies, academics, etc., to come into the same room to discuss and to sort of be able to meet in a common ground sort of situation to look at how we can advance these gender equality agendas within the Asia Pacific region. And that has been one of the things that we have been doing as a regional entity in Asia and Pacific. The other, and so one would ask that, I mean, that bringing civil society actors, bringing feminists, bringing women's human rights defenders on the table with policymakers, etc., can be a bit daunting. So to do that as a preparatory process, we have different processes, like I mentioned, the Gender and Climate Champions Academy, the Aero Advocacy Institute, etc., which look at building that sort of capacity for young people, for women in all their diversities, for intergenerational actors from grassroots and communities across Asia and Pacific to be able to then go to that table and to be able to make meaningful interventions in those areas. So this, a multi-stakeholder process, when you talk about it, is actually not just the 2-3 days that we actually go and be in the room with policymakers, but it is usually a 6-7 month process from where we start preparing civil society actors to be able to go and engage in these spaces. And sort of that has been what we have been doing in different issues, different intersectional issues, apart from the body of evidence that we produce with our national partners. To look at national level evidence-based advocacy. So and yeah, so that is, what our goal is, to be able to have SRHR integrated into language of policy documents, so that women and girls' voices are not lost in these documents, and our plight in terms of the health outcomes we face when SRHR is not integrated, and the GBV outcomes we face when SRHR and GBV is not integrated is not missed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for answering that question, Medka, and for sharing Arrow's work. And thank you to you for doing such important work. So my next question would be to Semiyan. What immediate steps should our audience, civil society, activists, donors, policymakers, take after this webinar, and what specific steps is ICANN taking right now?
So thank you so much for that question. As we reflect on the way forward, I believe that this conversation must move from dialogue to accountability and from awareness to action. So because every climate policy that fails to address women's health and safety is incomplete. Every sexual reproductive health right and GBV program that ignores the environment is unsustainable. That's what I believe. And what I've learned is that integration is not a slogan, it's a practice. And it's in how we budget, how our budget is written, how data is collected, and whose voices are listened to. So if I were to outline 3 highlights actions, I can say the first is accountability and data justice, whereby we need climate frameworks that track human reality, not just emissions or hectares restored, but how many women gain access to reproductive health services in climate-affected areas, or how many girls were protected from violence during displacement. That requires sex and age disaggregated data. That is, and willingness by donors and government to invest in gender environment research by local actors. So as ICANN, we are currently plotting a community-based data model where we collect stories and statistics for sexual reproductive health barriers during drought emergencies. And we want to show that data can be ethical, feminist, and inclusive. So the second one I can highlight is resources and power shift. What I mean by this is we must shift resources closer to the ones who live in the crisis. That direct funding to grassroots women and youth-led organizations who are already into the sexual reproductive health, bridging the gap between sexual reproductive health, GBV, and climate adaptation, instead of funneling everything through large intermediaries. So at ICANN, we are developing an EcoShe Resilience Hub, It's a safe space where Indigenous women and youth learn climate-smart livelihoods, leadership, and digital storytelling. It's a way of showing that climate justice must also heal and empower. And I want to emphasize this, that funding isn't just charity, it's equity. The people facing the harshest effect of climate crisis hold the deepest knowledge of resilience. And for the third point I would like to say is that movement building and solidarity. We cannot afford to work in solace anymore. Sexual reproductive health, GBV, climate justice continue sexual reproductive health, GBV, and climate justice communities need to share their language, tools, and advocacy space. This is why at ICANN, that is Inclusive Culture Action Network, we continue to partner with networks like Women and Gender Constituency. We love to connect with Arrow and Widow and youth feminists across Africa. Together, we can amplify voices that are often missing. Pastoralist girls, Indigenous mothers, young men challenging harmful norms, and ensure that gender action plan is not just a UN document, but a living, breathing framework of solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Simeon, and thank you for the important work that you are doing. You mentioned about accountability. So my next question and last question would be to Claudia. How can we build stronger accountability and monitoring to ensure integration of SRHR and GBV in climate justice? And how is WeDo approaching this challenge?
Okay, and so basically there's like two pieces. I think there's a monitor. So one is that within the gender action plan itself, there's a monitoring and reporting framework. So that monitoring and reporting framework is what will allow for implementation in the future to be adequately monitored. So I think beyond the call, and I think like really echoing what Semenya was saying, there is also this like part of what we can do as civil society is to report, to keep tabs on what is happening, and to also when the time comes for doing submissions, for engaging with countries, for like doing like all this type of like to guaranteeing that we have been noticing what has been happening. There's like different submissions process. There's different ways to engage with the gender action plan that will allow civil society to say, okay, this is what actually we have been doing on the ground. These are the frameworks that we have developed. This is what has happened, like with disasters. This is what happened. This is how GBV has escalated. This is how SRHR is like key to climate action. So there will be key points within the gender action plan, which is a 10-year time frame that will really allow for there to be like proper monitoring. But the idea really at COP30 is to like strongly advocate for so that that monitoring, that reporting is very like a foundational cornerstone of the gap. Because if we can't report on what is happening, if we can't say like this is what is happening, then it's going to be lost into the ether, and we're not going to be able to like continue making these policies better, more comprehensive, more inclusive. So that is one piece. But then there's the other one, like is the piece that I think to like I think piece I would like to highlight, that is what WeDo is doing. So part of WeDo's work is to work on these coalitions and part of the Women and Gender Constituency, but there's also the SRHR and Climate Justice Coalition. There's the Gender and Environment Data Alliance. There's different coalitions that will continue working at this intersection of gender and climate, and will continue really like fortifying that work, strengthening that work, contribute to that work. So I think again, like encouraging people here and like folks here to really join if you want to join, to be part of this work, and to because being part of this collective work against means that our voice is stronger, means that we can like help each other out, means we can build these bridges of solidarity, means that we can be present for each other. And that is like the most essential thing as we think about how to continue to like enhance this work and keep tabs on this work, and like visibilize this work, is to like join also these like coalition spaces. It also considering that we're all at like such limited capacity and that we're all like overloaded with so many things, but these spaces are still key to be able to advance gender and climate justice. And thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for sharing that and the important work that you are doing. And so, lastly, we have a few questions from the participants. So, I will ask those questions one by one. So, this question would be for you, Claudia. Which tool is most suitable for collecting gender disaggregated data in the Asian context?
Hmm, that's a great question. Most tool for I wouldn't say if I would recommend a specific tool. I think there's many different tools, and I think there's many ways of collecting data. I don't think there's a specific ideal way. I think, for example, there's different organizations that do like feminist participatory action research, which is based on honoring the work of communities and like making sure that there's like a shared ownership and shared stewardship of the data. So I think, for example, that is a very relevant feminist methodology that works. There's just, I think, like, for example, the Gender and Environment Data Alliance, there's a lot of work to understand different types of methodologies, different types of data collection methods. And I'm sure all of our organizations here have engaged with different types of data, even if we don't categorize it as data as such. So I wouldn't say there's a best one. I think data has to be is a very contextual thing. Data is a political thing. I don't think it's a thing that we can just like say like this is a separate thing from what we're doing, but rather it's very according to like specific national circumstances and specific like local context and specific community context. So I think, yeah, it'd be hard for me to say like there's a best one, but I think there's many multiple ones, and that it's a constant exploration of which ones are good for their specific context.
Thank you for answering that question, Claudia. And like if from the panel anyone wants to add to this question, please feel free to add. Okay. So I think the last question is from Mohammed, and he's asking in a context where youth climate advocates rely heavily on donor and institutional funding, how can they speak truth to power about extractive realities of green growth and sustainability, especially from a global north perspective? Which often rest on the exploitation of marginalized labor and lands without risking their support or visibility. Would you like to take this question?
Kindly reduce the question one more time. I want to just capture the exact words.
Sure. So he's asking that in a context where youth climate advocates rely on donor and institutional funding, how can they speak truth to power without risking their support or visibility?
So to that question, I can say that speaking the truth of power is very delicate, and especially for youth advocates who rely on donors and institutional funding. I can say that the core principle is strategic advocacy and rooted integrity in evidence, um, whereby you can say that let me give an example with my organization. So at ICANN, we ground advocacy in data, lived experience, and tangible results. So for example, when we raise the connection between climate stress and GBV and reproductive health, climate crises, and all that, it's not just opinions, it's the approach, the decision making. This approach makes it harder because of the decision making for the donors to dismiss the perspective. Secondly, I can say that building alliance is essential. That is very important. Collaborating with CSOs, local government, regional network, amplifying their voice while sharing the risk. For instance, in our leadership through Green Action program, we partner with local clinics and schools by embodying advocacy and joint intervention. And thirdly, for that answer, I can say that framing matters. we frame our message around solution and mutual benefit. So showing our support, for him, I can say that showing their support with youth-led organization, just how you frame is very important. So yeah, framing is very important. So finally, I can say that resilience is key in that, and that the power to occasionally involve risk, and as a youth leader, you must maintain transparency, collective support, and ethical courage. Advocacy is most effective when it's informed and grounded, and community needs are heard. So the truth telling strengthens credibility rather than threaten visibility. I think I've answered his question.
Yes, you have. Thank you, Samian. And anything you'd like to add, Menka, and then we'll close this session.
Yeah, I think for young people, and especially with the balance with the funded programming, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah. I think for it's good to also have a resource mobilization strategy where the types of donors that you would want to engage with. Having a principled approach in that is also going to be helpful. We are increasingly going towards funding from corporates, from large corporations, from philanthropies, private foundations, etc. It's also good to know the type of business that they're also engaged in. It's just not about the government or bilateral money that we're accessing, but also private foundation, etc. money that we do access. So having that sort of analysis, and there's a lot of organizations that are doing this type of work. I know AWID does a lot of this types of analysis and have put out a couple of documents around that. So just having that principled approach as young people would also be quite effective in your ability to be able to then do that sort of integral work around questioning extractive industries or work that is being done around extractive industries. And this is also where evidence-based advocacy also comes in handy, because when you do advocacy and you speak from a lens of evidence and research, there's very little very little debunking that can happen, because you're definitely presenting a point not just from thin air, but from a perspective of evidence and data. So and so that's where also the importance of evidence-based advocacy lies as well. So some groundwork in terms of analysis on who you are tapping into in terms of resources, but also your own politics on how you want to frame that, and also some as feminists, I think also some personal investigation as well on how we are also perpetuators of these types of structural violence. So as young people, I think we just have to kind of imbibe those principles. Of course, we are all not perfect, but having a reflection on that is going to be great, a good starter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Menka. And I would like to thank all of you for joining this session. This has been a great conversation and discussion. And the key takeaways has been that it's important to understand the intersectionalities of SRHR, GBV, climate justice, and also to make responses and actions more inclusive of gender in all its diversities, and also important to add context and nuances to it. And lastly, I would say that like all of us mentioned that it's very important to share solidarity and collectively advocate to build the movement. And so thank you so much for agreeing to do this and for sharing great insights. This has been a wonderful session and a very learning experience for me as well. So thank you so much for doing that. Um, I hope you have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, too.
Thank you so much. Take care,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Take care, everyone. Bye.